Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I rise to join my colleagues in this important conversation on the Senate floor and to once again demand answers to the many questions raised about Russia's interference in our elections. Now, not so long ago, I came to this floor to speak out against a belligerent act from an adversarial nation, an attempt to undermine American democracy and for immense chaos and uncertainty on the world stage, an effort that we now know from our own intelligence community's assessment was ordered by President Putin himself, a campaign that senior intelligence officials have concluded, and I quote, blended covert intelligence operations such as cyber activity with overt efforts by Russian government agencies, state-funded media, third-party intermediaries, and paid social media users or trolls to undermine our 2016 presidential elections. In recent weeks, the American people have been confronted by a daily drumbeat of headlines regarding Russian interference in our elections and possible ties to President Trump's campaign. They learned that the president's former national security advisor, General Michael Flynn, was not truthful about the nature of the conversations he had with the Russian ambassador shortly after President Obama sanctioned Russia for meddling in our elections. They learned that Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the highest law enforcement officer in the land, did not fully disclose at least 2 meetings he had with the Russian ambassador during his nomination hearings. They learned through reporting in the news media that U.S. law enforcement continues to investigate Russian agents' contacts with President Trump's inner circle. And yet, despite these revelations, the American people now face more questions than answers. Has anyone else on the president's team been in contact with the Russian government? What were the nature of those conversations? How credible are reports of business dealings between Russian oligarchs and the Trump organization? But here's the reason that I came to the floor today, as serious as those questions are. Getting answers to these questions, whether it be through a special prosecutor or an independent commission that Senator Cardin has legislation on, which I strongly support and believe it's the ultimate vehicle, or the Senate Intelligence Committee's own investigation those efforts is not about President Trump. It's about the American people. It's about protecting our free and democratic way of life and our time-tested system of self-governance. It's about showing our constituents that when the stakes are high, when the allegations are this startling, when the implications are this alarming, we are capable of setting politics aside and getting to the truth. Time and time again, the president has dismissed the significance of Russia's interference in our elections, and he derides reports about his financial interests and campaign contacts with Russia as, quote, fake news. Well, this isn't fake news. On the contrary, these are real threats from a real foreign adversary, real threats that undermine the integrity of our elections and therefore the security of our country, real threats from a brutal leader who sees the erosion of Western democracy as a strategic imperative for Russia's future. So let's be clear about why these threats matter. Vladimir Putin's rise to power in Russia has been marked by the suppression of the freedom of the press, the oppression of the Russian people, the murder of political opponents, and the transfer of wealth and assets from the Russian people to a handful of powerful oligarchs. President Putin sees the spread of Western democratic values that we enjoy here in our country and others in the Western world, like freedom of speech and the rule of law and human rights, as a threat to his power. And so Russia has embarked on a systematic campaign to undermine the democracies that uphold the international order that was established after World War II and has been the bedrock of peace and tranquility, generally speaking, since then. These threats must be taken seriously. Russia's aggressive behavior reaches back years and extends to this day. We saw it in 2008 when Russia backed illegal separatist forces in Georgia, declaring South Ossetia and Abkhazia independent states. We saw it in March of 2014 when I was in Ukraine, when Russia authorized the use of military force to annex Crimea, blatantly violating the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people, and the Budapest Memorandum, a memorandum that we, the United States and Russia, among others, signed, saying that we would observe the territorial and sovereignty rights of Ukraine if they gave up the nuclear weapons that had been left to them after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they did just that. They did just that. And what happened to them afterwards? Their territory has been annexed and invaded. Today, Putin continues to break ceasefires, sow discord, incite violence throughout eastern Ukraine, an effort that to date has claimed 10,000 lives and displaced 2 million people. And unfortunately, Russia's interference in our 2016 presidential elections is not an isolated incident. According to U.S. intelligence reports, these efforts are only the most recent manifestation of the Kremlin's ongoing campaign to undermine Western democracy. In recent years, we've seen Russian oligarchs funnel money to fringe political movements across Europe, and Russian operatives conduct sophisticated disinformation campaigns. And after the revelations that Russia interfered in our own elections, Putin has shown no signs of slowing down. On the contrary, just weeks ago, Russia's defense minister announced that the Kremlin will begin using troops to enhance their information operations, emphasizing that, quote, propaganda must be smart, competent, and efficient. Again, Russia's end goal here is no mystery. Putin aims to undermine European unity and fracture the transatlantic alliance, an alliance that has served as the bedrock for international security, peace and stability, and economic cooperation between the United States and Europe for over past a century. In the Middle East, President Putin continues to disregard international norms. He aligns Russia with Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terror. He aids Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad in his atrocities against innocent civilians. In Aleppo, Russian bombs fall on homes. Russian bombs fall on schools and hospitals. Russian bombs fall on aid convoys that only seek to feed starving, trapped families and rescue children from the rubble. Just last month, Russia violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty when they illegally launched a cruise missile, showing no regard for an agreement that has been a hallmark for nuclear security cooperation for nearly 4 decades. That is not an insignificant act. The United States cannot ignore such destabilizing behavior. That's exactly why Senator Graham and I introduced S. Resolution 78 just 2 weeks ago, recognizing 3 years of Russian military aggression and calling on Russia to respect its obligations to the international community. Our resolution should serve as a reminder to this administration that the U.S. sanctions imposed on Russia for violating the international order should remain in place until Russia starts respecting and returning to that international norm. Nor can we let Russia's efforts undermine Western democracies to continue unabated. That's why I've joined my colleagues in the Countering Russia Hostilities Act of 2017. This bipartisan bill codifies the sanctions imposed by President Obama for Russia's annexation of Crimea and interference in the U.S. elections into law. It's the same type of proposition that we had with the Iran agreement. We want a congressional opportunity to voice ourselves and make sure that those sanctions aren't lifted arbitrarily and capriciously without Russia paying the consequences and coming back into the international order. And at the same time, the legislation authorizes $100 million for the State Department and other agencies to counter Putin's propaganda. So the time for action and for answers is now. We can get to work immediately by holding hearings in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to ensure that the United States has a strategy in place to protect the security of our democracy and to promote stability abroad. From the spread of extremist propaganda across Europe, the denial of Ukrainian sovereignty, to the bombing of civilians in Aleppo and the cyber attacks against the Democratic National Committee, Putin's intentions are not up for debate. Russia's destabilizing behavior should be made absolutely clear to the President of the United States that the Russian Federation is not our friend. But when the President hesitates to acknowledge this reality or fails to address such aggressive behavior, it's up to Congress to act. There can be no hesitation when it comes to protecting the security and sanctity of our elections. But to take action, we need answers. That's why we need an independent investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 elections. When President Trump fails to realize time and time again is that this investigation is not about whether or not Russia successfully swayed the American elections. This investigation is not about him. This investigation is about the American people. It's about ensuring that our elections are free, fair, and secure, so that the government that we elect is responsive and accountable to the people. It's about understanding Russia's tactics in cyberspace and preparing for future attacks. It's about standing with our allies, preserving peace and avoiding war, and preventing the needs to send our sons and daughters into harm's way. It's about ensuring that when the President of the United States faces tough decisions, the American people can trust that he puts their interests ahead of any other interests he has abroad. It's time to protect the integrity of our elections and to secure our democracy against the cyber threats of the 21st century. Whether they come in the form of election machine tampering or paid propaganda on social media or targeted hacks on political and public officials. Mr. President, Russia poses a real strategic threat to the United States, to our core values, and to the international order. I call on the President to treat these threats with the seriousness that they deserve. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to protect the integrity of our elections here at home, defend democracy abroad, and ensure that that transatlantic alliance, so vital to international security and stability, remains strong for generations to come. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.